The Silken Cage, a history of the Ottoman Harem's secret desires. Come closer. Listen not to the clamor of battles or the pronouncements of statesmen, but to the whispers that drift from behind latticed windows. In the heart of the sprawling Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, for centuries, there existed a world within a world. A place of legend, of fantasy, and of profound misunderstanding. We call it the harem. The word itself conjures images painted by Western artists who never set foot inside. Opulent rooms filled with languid, half-dressed women, their only purpose to please a singular, all-powerful master. A fantasy of endless, available sensuality. But this vision, like a desert mirage, is both enticing and deeply untrue. The reality of the imperial harem was infinitely more complex, more political, and more human. It was not a brothel. It was a home, a school, a political arena, and a prison forged from silk and gold. It was the family home of the Sultan, the engine of the Ottoman dynasty, and the place where the empire's future was conceived, quite literally, in acts of ritualized desire. Tonight, we will part the beaded curtains and step across the threshold of felicity. We will breathe in the air thick with the scent of jasmine, oud, and ambition. We will explore the intricate web of power, survival, and sexuality that defined life within these gilded walls. This is not just a history of sultans and their consorts. It is a history of desire itself. Desire for power, for love, for freedom, and for a legacy that could outlive the confines of the cage. This is the story of the harem's secret heart. The journey to the harem almost always began with a rupture, a violent tearing away from one life to be thrust into another. Few women entered these walls by choice. They were spoils of war, gifts from foreign dignitaries, or, most commonly, purchased in the bustling slave markets of the Black Sea coast or the Barbary states. They were Circassians, famed for their ethereal beauty, Georgians with their sharp intellects, Slavs, Abyssinians, and Europeans, each a testament to the vast reach of the Ottoman Empire. This is the story of the harem's secret heart. Let us imagine one such girl. We will call her Nadia. She is from a small village in the Caucasus Mountains. Her world is one of snow-capped peaks, the scent of pine, and the familiar cadence of her family's voices. One day, that world is shattered by a slave raid. She is bound, transported for weeks in the stifling hold of a ship, and finally finds herself blinking in the blinding sun of the Istanbul slave market. Here, she is treated not as a person, but as precious livestock. Her teeth are checked, her limbs examined, her skin prodded for imperfections. She is terrified, stripped of her name, her family, and her language. But she possesses a certain quality, a spark in her dark eyes, a proud set to her shoulders. That catches the eye of a palace scout. She is purchased not for a wealthy merchant, but for the most exclusive household in the world, the Sultan's imperial harem. Upon arrival, Nadia ceases to exist. She is taken to the receiving chambers where her old, rough-spun clothes are removed and burned. She is bathed by other women in the hammam, the palatial bathhouse, a cavern of marble, steam, and echoing whispers. The water is scented with rose and orange blossom. Her skin is scrubbed raw, her hair is washed and combed with oils, and every part of her is purified, erasing the grime of the outside world. She is given a new name, something Turkish and poetic, like Lalezar, meaning tulip garden. Lalezar, the girl who was once Nadia, is now a Kadiye, the lowest rank in the harem. She is a novice, a student. She joins a class of other girls, all with similar stories of loss and bewilderment. Their education begins immediately, and it is as rigorous as any military academy. This is the first great misconception of the harem, that it was a place of idleness. In truth, it was a finely tuned machine for creating the perfect imperial consort. The girls learned the Turkish language and were required to convert to Islam. They were taught to read and write, to master poetry, and to understand the intricate rules of palace etiquette. A misplaced glance, an improper bow, or a word spoken out of turn could result in harsh punishment. They were taught music, learning to play the oud or the tanbour. They were taught to dance, not with vulgar sensuality, but with a grace and elegance befitting royalty. They were taught to sew and embroider with threads of silver and gold. And of course, they were taught the arts of seduction and pleasure. This was not the crude instruction one might imagine. It was a subtle education imparted by older, more experienced women. It was about how to move, how to speak in a pleasing tone, how to perfume one's skin, how to anticipate a man's desires without ever seeming forward. It was an education in psychology as much as physicality. They learned that the ultimate power was not in the body, but in the ability to captivate the mind of the most powerful man in the world. For Lalezar and the others, this period was a confusing blend of fear and opportunity. They were slaves, owned body and soul by the Sultan. Yet they lived in a luxury their families could never have imagined. They ate from porcelain dishes, slept on silken sheets, and were surrounded by staggering beauty. They were imprisoned, but the cage was a magnificent one. And within this cage, there was a ladder of favor, of desire, and of blood. Every girl knew that a single glance from the Sultan could elevate her from an anonymous Kariye to the mother of a future emperor. And so they learned, they watched, and they waited for their chance. To understand the sexual politics of the harem, one must first understand its rigid, almost military hierarchy. This was not a chaotic sea of beautiful women. It was a structured society with clearly defined roles, privileges, and paths to power. A woman's entire existence, her daily allowance, the quality of her fabrics, the number of her servants, and her proximity to the Sultan was dictated by her rank. At the very bottom were the Kariye, the novices like our Lalezar. They were the students and servants of the harem, performing the daily chores, serving food, cleaning chambers, and attending to the higher-ranking women. They were, in essence, invisible, yet they were the foundation upon which the entire institution rested. From this pool of hundreds of girls, a few might be promoted. If a Kariye showed particular grace, intelligence, or beauty, she could become an odalisque. The word odalisque is often mistranslated in the West as a concubine, but her initial role was more akin to a chambermaid to the powerful women of the harem, the Sultan's mother, his sisters, or his favorite consorts. An odalisque was not, by definition, part of the Sultan's sexual retinue. However, her position brought her closer to the centers of power. She might be seen by the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, or even by the Sultan himself during a visit to his mother's quarters. This proximity was everything. If an odalisque or even a gifted Kariye managed to catch the Sultan's eye, her life would change overnight. She would become a gozde, which translates to the favored one, or literally, in the eye. She was now officially a concubine. She would be given her own private chambers, better clothes, a larger allowance, and her own servants. She had ascended the first and most crucial rung of the ladder. She had been chosen. The life of a gozde was one of perpetual hope and anxiety. She had the Sultan's attention, but for how long? The Sultan had hundreds of women to choose from. To maintain her position, she had to be more than beautiful. She had to be interesting, witty, and a master of the art of companionship. If a gozde continued to please the Sultan and, most importantly, became pregnant, her status would rise again. Upon bearing a child, she could be elevated to the rank of Iqbal. And Iqbal was a fortunate or favored consort. Her position was now more secure. She was no longer just a fleeting fancy. She was the mother of a member of the dynasty. Her allowance would increase dramatically, and she would command significant respect. If her child was a son, a Shehzadeh, her power grew exponentially.
Above the Iqbals were the Khadans, the official wives of the Sultan. Early in Ottoman history, sultans took legal wives from foreign royal houses. But after the 15th century, they largely ceased to marry, preferring to procreate with slave concubines. This was a calculated political move. It prevented the rise of powerful, noble in-law families who could challenge the sultan's authority. The mothers of princes, being slaves, had no family or power base outside of the sultan himself. Their loyalty was absolute. Later, this custom would change, but the principle remained. A Khadan was typically a long-term favorite, often the mother of several children, who was granted a status equivalent to a wife. There were usually 4 and later up to 8 Khadans. At the apex of this female hierarchy, however, was not the sultan's favorite consort, but his mother, the Valide Sultan. She was the absolute ruler of the harem. No woman could enter or leave, be promoted or punished without her consent. She managed the harem's vast finances, chose the women for her son's bed, and was his most trusted advisor. The Valide Sultan was often the most powerful woman and sometimes the most powerful person in the entire Ottoman Empire. Her authority was supreme, her word law within these walls. And who enforced that law? The guardians of this female world were men who were not quite men, the eunuchs. The harem was guarded by the Quslar Agasa, the chief black eunuch. He was a figure of immense power, controlling access to the harem and serving as the liaison between the women and the outside world. He was the Valide Sultan's right hand. Below him was a corps of other black eunuchs, each tasked with guarding the harem's gates and corridors. They were the jailers, the messengers, and the confidants. They saw everything and heard everything. They were the silent, watchful eyes of the silken cage, and their story is as central to the harem's sexuality as the sultan's own. This intricate system of ranks and roles turned the harem into a hotbed of ambition, where every smile was a calculation and every whisper a potential strategy in the relentless game of desire and power. The sexual life of the sultan was not a matter of spontaneous passion. It was a state affair, a ritual as choreographed as any court ceremony. The continuation of the sacred Ottoman dynasty rested upon his shoulders, and his encounters were managed with meticulous care by the one person he trusted above all, his mother, the Valide Sultan. It was she, often in consultation with the Quslar Agasa, who would select a woman for the sultan's bed. The choice could be based on a recommendation from the harem's mistresses who had noted a girl's exceptional talent in music or dance. It could be a political move to placate a faction within the harem, or it could be that the sultan himself had noticed a particular girl while walking through the gardens or during a celebration. The popular legend, likely an invention of the European imagination, speaks of the sultan dropping a handkerchief at the feet of his chosen one. While the reality was probably a more discreet verbal command given to an attendant, the symbolism holds true. A signal was given and a life was about to be irrevocably altered. For the chosen girl, let us say our Lalezar has finally become a Gozde and this is her first summons, the preparations were elaborate and transformative. She was led immediately to the hammam. This was not a simple bath. It was a rite of purification that could last for hours. Attendants would scrub her skin with coarse mitts until it was soft and glowing. Her body hair was removed with a special paste called rusma. Her hair was washed with scented soaps and treated with nourishing oils. Her hands and feet might be decorated with intricate henna patterns. After the bath, she was taken to a dressing chamber where the finest garments were laid out for her. Undergarments of the sheerest silk, trousers of embroidered brocade, and a gown that shimmered with threads of real gold or silver. She was adorned with jewels from the palace treasury, pearl drop earrings, a diamond necklace, emerald and ruby rings. Finally, the most important touch, perfume. Each woman had her own signature scent, a carefully guarded blend of musk, ambergris, rose, or jasmine, dabbed onto her pulse points. She was being transformed from a mere woman into a living work of art, an offering fit for the shadow of God on earth.
When she was ready, she was not simply led to the Sultan's bedroom. She had to walk the Golden Road, the Altın Yol. This was a long paved corridor connecting the harem to the Sultan's private chambers in the third court of the palace. It was a journey of immense psychological weight. For a girl who had spent months or years living in the communal quarters, this walk was a passage into another realm. The corridor was silent, save for the soft rustle of her own silks and the distant sounds of the palace. It was a walk towards a destiny that could bring unimaginable power or crushing disappointment. At the end of the Golden Road, she would be met by the Sultan's personal attendant. The final rules of etiquette were observed. It was customary for her to enter the Sultan's chambers, bow, and kiss the hem of his sofa or bed. She was to approach his bed from the foot, a sign of her subservient position.
What happened within the imperial bedchamber is lost to history, shrouded in the privacy of the Sultan. But it was far more than a physical act. For the Sultan, it was a moment of respite from the crushing pressures of state, a moment of human connection, however fleeting. For the woman, it was a performance. Her entire education had led to this moment. She had to be enchanting, graceful, and submissive, yet also captivating enough to be remembered. Her goal was not just to provide a night of pleasure, but to forge a connection that would lead to a second invitation and then a third. The greatest prize, of course, was conception. A night that resulted in a pregnancy, especially with a son, was the ultimate victory. It was the moment a woman's body became a vessel for the dynasty. After the encounter, tradition dictated that if the Sultan was pleased, he would send the woman a gift of fine fabrics, jewels, or a purse of gold coins the next morning. The entire harem would be watching for the arrival of this gift. Its appearance was a public announcement of her success. She had walked the Golden Road and returned with favor. Her rivals would seethe with jealousy, her allies would celebrate, and her own status would be instantly elevated. She was no longer just one of the many. She had shared the bed of the Padishah. She had entered the great game, and if she played her cards right, she could one day rule it. If the Sultan's bedchamber was the gateway to power, the womb was the battlefield where the harem's greatest wars were fought. A woman's beauty, wit, or talent could secure her a few nights of favor, but only one thing could grant her lasting security and influence: a child. Specifically, a son. When a woman in the harem, an Iqbal or a Kadin, became pregnant, she was immediately enveloped in a cocoon of privilege and paranoia. She was given the best chambers, served the most nourishing food, and attended by her own retinue of servants and midwives. Her well-being was now a matter of state importance. But this elevated status also made her a target. The harem was a cauldron of jealousy. Every woman vied for the Sultan's attention, and a pregnancy was the most visible sign of his favor. The rivals of the expectant mother would watch her with envy that often curdled into malice. Whispers would fly through the corridors like poisoned darts. Was the child truly the Sultan's? Would she carry it to term? History and palace folklore are rife with tales of plots against pregnant concubines. Stories abound of rivals attempting to induce a miscarriage through secretly administered herbs, or of placing cursed objects in a woman's chambers. Black magic and talismans were a part of daily life. A pregnant woman would wear amulets to ward off the evil eye, and the Valide Sultan would post loyal eunuchs to guard her chambers day and night. While it is difficult to separate historical fact from slanderous rumor, the pervasive fear was very real. A successful pregnancy was not just a biological event, it was a political triumph over a host of unseen enemies. The birth itself was a momentous occasion. If the child was a daughter, a sultana, there would be celebrations. Daughters were valuable assets to be married off to powerful viziers or pashas to forge political alliances. But the birth of a daughter did not fundamentally alter the balance of power within the harem. The birth of a son, a Shekhzadeh, was an event that shook the foundations of the palace. Cannons would be fired from the palace walls to announce the news to the city.
The Sultan would bestow lavish gifts upon the mother, who would now be honored with the title of Haseki, or chief consort, if she was his primary favorite. She was no longer just a woman. She was the mother of a potential future sultan. Her power was now real and tangible. She would have her own vast household, control over significant funds, and the ear of the sultan in a way no other could. But this triumph was shadowed by a terrible, uniquely Ottoman dread. For much of the empire's history, the succession was not based on primogeniture, where the eldest son inherits. Instead, the throne was open to any of the sultan's sons. It was a brutal form of Darwinian selection. May the most cunning and ruthless son win. To prevent the decades of civil war that had plagued the early empire, Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror institutionalized a chilling practice known as the Law of Fratricide. This law stated that upon ascending the throne, the new sultan had the right, indeed the duty, to execute all of his brothers and half-brothers to ensure the stability of the empire. A new sultan's reign often began with the quiet, chilling work of the royal executioners, who would strangle the other princes with a silk bowstring, as shedding royal blood was forbidden. This law turned motherhood into a life-or-death gamble. The women of the harem were not just raising sons, they were raising either a future emperor or a future victim. The bond between a mother and her princely son was incredibly intense. She would become his chief political advisor, his protector, and his champion. She would spend her life forging alliances, gathering intelligence, and maneuvering to ensure that when the old sultan died, it was her son who reached the throne first.
The harem, therefore, became divided into factions, each centered around a Haseki and her son. The women would scheme against one another, spreading rumors to discredit rival princes in the eyes of the sultan. They would bribe viziers and generals to support their son's cause. The love of a mother in this context became a fierce political weapon. The joy of childbirth was forever tainted by the terrifying knowledge that in this gilded cage, the birth of one son could be a death sentence for another. The nursery was not a place of innocence, it was the first stage of a battle for survival. No discussion of the harem's sexuality and power is complete without understanding the strange, liminal figures who were its guardians, the eunuchs. They were men defined by what they had lost, a loss that granted them a unique and paradoxical power within the Ottoman court. They were the bridge between the secluded female world of the harem and the male world of imperial politics. There were two main classes of eunuchs in the palace. The white eunuchs, primarily sourced from the Caucasus or the Balkans, served in the outer administrative sections of the palace, guarding the sultan's throne room and acting as his personal servants. They were powerful, but they were forbidden from entering the deepest sanctums of the harem. The inner world, the imperial harem itself, was the exclusive domain of the black eunuchs. These men were captured as boys from regions in Africa, particularly from the Nile Valley. They underwent the brutal procedure of castration and were sold into service. Those who survived were brought to the palace, where they began a life of training and discipline. Their physical alteration placed them in a unique social category. They could not father children and thus could never establish a rival dynasty. Their loyalty, in theory, was indivisible and belonged solely to the sultan. They were seen as safe guardians for the sultan's women, their inability to procreate making them harmless in a world obsessed with bloodlines and legitimacy. At the head of this corps was the Kızlar Aga, the chief black eunuch. His title meant Aga of the girls, but his power extended far beyond that. By the 17th century, he was the third most powerful official in the entire empire, behind only the Sultan and the Grand Vizier. He controlled the harem's massive budget, managed all the imperial religious foundations, and had the Sultan's ear daily. He was the main channel of communication between the Valide Sultan and the outside world. Pashas and ambassadors sought his favor, knowing that a word from him could make or break a career. On a daily basis, the eunuchs were the harem's administrators, disciplinarians, and jailers. They controlled the flow of all goods, food, fabric, jewels into the harem. They delivered messages, spied on the concubines for the Valide Sultan, and enforced the rigid rules of conduct. A concubine who broke a rule would be reported by a eunuch and could face punishment ranging from a beating to confinement. But their role was far more complex than that of simple guards. Because they were the only men the women of the harem interacted with regularly, they often became their closest confidants. The women were isolated, far from their homes and families. A kind eunuch could be a friend, a shoulder to cry on, a source of news from the outside world. He could be an ally, passing a secret message or pleading a woman's case to the Valide Sultan. This intimacy, of course, was fraught with danger and ambiguity. While they were physically incapable of fathering children, this did not necessarily extinguish all forms of romantic or emotional attachment. Forbidden friendships and even love affairs, chaste though they must have been, are known to have blossomed in the hushed corridors of the harem. A eunuch might champion one woman over another, using his influence to help her catch the sultan's eye, becoming a key player in her rise to power. His fate became tied to hers. If she succeeded, he would be rewarded. If she failed, he might fall with her. They were figures of immense pity and immense power. They were slaves who commanded generals. They were men deprived of their manhood who controlled the futures of the empire's mothers. They lived in a world of women, but could never truly belong. They were the ultimate insiders and the ultimate outsiders. The silent, unseen hands that orchestrated the daily life of the silken cage. Their own lost desires and ambitions echoing in the very architecture of the harem they guarded. Their presence was a constant, stark reminder of the lengths the dynasty would go to control and commodify desire. The entire structure of the harem was built around a single axis of desire, the sultan. Hundreds of women were brought to the palace for the sole purpose of being available to him. Their lives were a competition for his affection, his bed, and his seed. But what of their own desires? What happens to the human heart when it is caged and its affections are so narrowly dictated? The entire structure of the harem was built around a single axis of desire, the sultan. Hundreds of women were brought to the palace for the sole purpose of being available to him. Their lives were a competition for his affection, his bed, and his seed. But what of their own desires? What happens to the human heart when it is caged and its affections are so narrowly dictated? Within the perfumed walls of the harem, away from the gaze of the sultan or the watchful eyes of the eunuchs, other forms of love and intimacy flourished in the shadows. The most profound and common of these were the deep emotional bonds formed between the women themselves. These were women who had shared the traumatic experience of capture and enslavement. They had learned a new language and a new religion together. They spent every waking moment in each other's company, sharing meals, bathing in the hammam, sleeping in communal dormitories in their early years. They were sisters in circumstance, and from this shared experience, powerful friendships grew. They confided in one another, protected each other from rivals, and offered comfort in times of homesickness and despair. Inevitably, some of these intense friendships blossomed into love. Sapphic relationships were a known, if officially unacknowledged, aspect of harem life. In a world where heterosexual contact was a state-controlled monopoly of one man, it is only natural that women would turn to each other for the emotional and physical intimacy they craved. These relationships were a source of genuine affection in a life that was often transactional. They offered a space of privacy and emotional honesty away from the relentless posturing required to survive. These bonds were, of course, dangerous. If a relationship was perceived as a threat to the harem's order, or if it caused a jealous dispute that came to the attention of the authorities, the punishment could be severe. Yet they persisted, a quiet rebellion of the heart against the rigid structures of the state. These relationships are difficult for historians to document, as they were, by their nature, secret.
They exist mostly in whispers, in the lines of poetry written by harem women, and in the condemnations of scandalized observers. But they were undoubtedly a crucial part of the harem's emotional ecosystem. What of desire for men other than the sultan? Such a thing was the ultimate taboo, an act of treason against the padishah himself. The harem was designed to be impenetrable, a fortress of chastity. Yet, human ingenuity and desire can often find cracks in the most formidable walls. Stories, perhaps apocryphal but persistent, tell of secret affairs. A handsome young musician brought in to teach the women, a charismatic tutor, or a palace guard who caught a concubine's eye through a latticed window. The risks were astronomical. For the woman, discovery meant certain death, often by being tied in a weighted sack and thrown into the Bosphorus. For her lover, the fate would be just as swift and brutal.
More plausible, perhaps, were the complex, non-physical attachments formed with the eunuchs. As we have explored, these men were confidants and friends. Could this friendship deepen into a form of love? A tragic, impossible love between two people, both captive in their own way, who could offer each other companionship but never a shared future or a physical consummation of their bond. This was a love of whispered conversations in shadowy alcoves, of shared glances, of small, secret kindnesses. It was a poignant testament to the human need for connection in the most restrictive of environments. The harem was not a place devoid of love. It was, rather, a place where love was forced to take on new and resilient forms. It existed in the fierce, protective bond of a mother for her son, in the loyal sisterhood between two Kariye, in the secret, tender romance between two women, and in the impossible affection for a forbidden man. These hidden currents of emotion ran deep beneath the surface of the harem's official life, a reminder that even in a gilded cage, the human heart will always seek out its own object of desire. For centuries, the women of the harem were intended to be beautiful, fertile, and, above all, politically silent. They were slaves whose purpose was to serve the sultan and produce heirs, remaining invisible behind the palace walls. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, something extraordinary happened. The cage door, if not opened, was at least unlocked from the inside. A succession of brilliant, ambitious, and ruthless harem women shattered convention and seized the reins of power, ruling the vast Ottoman Empire from the depths of the Seraglio. This period became known as the Kadınlar Saltanati, the Sultanate of Women. The revolution began with a woman known to the West as Roxolana and to the Turks as Hürrem Sultan. Captured as a young girl from Ruthenia, modern-day Ukraine, she entered the harem of Suleiman the Magnificent, one of the empire's greatest rulers. She was not considered a classic beauty, but she possessed an irresistible intelligence, charm, and wit. Suleiman became utterly besotted with her. He broke with centuries of tradition by freeing her and making her his legal wife, an act that scandalized the court. Hürrem was not content to be a passive consort. She became Suleiman's closest political advisor. She corresponded with foreign kings, managed state affairs when he was away on campaign, and commissioned massive public works projects. She also ruthlessly eliminated her rivals. She maneuvered to have Suleiman's firstborn son, Mustafa, from another consort, executed on charges of treason, clearing the path for her own son, Selim, to inherit the throne. Hürrem transformed the role of the Sultan's favorite from a bedmate into a co-ruler, an empress in all but name. She demonstrated that the Sultan's desire could be forged into a devastating political weapon.
As we have explored, these men were confidants and friends. Could this friendship deepen into a form of love? A tragic, impossible love between two people, both captive in their own way, who could offer each other companionship but never a shared future or a physical consummation of their bond. This was a love of whispered conversations and shadowy alcoves, of shared glances, of small, secret kindnesses. It was a poignant testament to the human need for connection in the most restrictive of environments.
The harem was not a place devoid of love. It was, rather, a place where love was forced to take on new and resilient forms. It existed in the fierce, protective bond of a mother for her son, in the loyal sisterhood between two courtiers, in the secret, tender romance between two women, and in the impossible affection for a forbidden man. These hidden currents of emotion ran deep beneath the surface of the harem's official life, a reminder that even in a gilded cage, the human heart will always seek out its own object of desire. For centuries, the women of the harem were intended to be beautiful, fertile, and, above all, politically silent. They were slaves whose purpose was to serve the sultan and produce heirs, remaining invisible behind the palace walls. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, something extraordinary happened. The cage door, if not opened, was at least unlocked from the inside. A succession of brilliant, ambitious, and ruthless harem women shattered convention and seized the reins of power, ruling the vast Ottoman Empire from the depths of the Seraglio. This period became known as the Kadınlar Saltanatı, the Sultanate of Women. The revolution began with a woman known to the West as Roxolana and to the Turks as Hürrem Sultan. Captured as a young girl from Ruthenia, modern-day Ukraine, she entered the harem of Suleiman the Magnificent, one of the empire's greatest rulers. She was not considered a classic beauty, but she possessed an irresistible intelligence, charm, and wit. Suleiman became utterly besotted with her. He broke with centuries of tradition by freeing her and making her his legal wife, an act that scandalized the court. Hürrem was not content to be a passive consort. She became Suleiman's closest political advisor. She corresponded with foreign kings, managed state affairs when he was away on campaign, and commissioned massive public works projects. She also ruthlessly eliminated her rivals. She maneuvered to have Suleiman's firstborn son, Mustafa, from another consort, executed on charges of treason, clearing the path for her own son, Selim, to inherit the throne. Hürrem transformed the role of the Sultan's favorite from a bedmate into a co-ruler, an empress in all but name. She demonstrated that the Sultan's desire could be forged into a devastating political weapon.
The power of the harem women only grew after Hürrem. Later, during a period of weaker, less effective sultans, the Valide sultans and Haseki sultans became the true power behind the throne. Women like Nurbanu Sultan and Safiya Sultan effectively ran the empire. But the apex of the Sultanate of Yemen came with a figure of almost mythical power, Kösem Sultan. Kösem entered the harem as a teenager and became the favorite of Sultan Ahmed I. She was not his wife, but she bore him numerous children, including 2 future sultans. After Ahmed's death, she was sidelined, but her political acumen was unmatched. Through a series of intricate maneuvers, she managed to see her son, Murad IV, ascend the throne. As he was only a boy, she was appointed the official regent of the Ottoman Empire, the first of only 2 women in history to formally hold that title. For nearly a decade, she ruled openly. She attended meetings of the State Council, the Diwan, from behind a screen, dictating policy to the Grand Vizier and his pashas. She controlled army appointments, managed the treasury, and directed foreign policy. Even after her son came of age, her influence remained immense. When he died, she engineered the succession of another of her sons, the mentally unstable Ibrahim. And when he proved too erratic to rule, Kösem conspired to have him deposed and executed, placing her 7-year-old grandson, Mehmed IV, on the throne. This made her regent for a second time. She was now the grandmother of the reigning sultan, a position of unprecedented power. But her ambition had created a powerful rival, her own daughter-in-law, Turhan Sultan, the young sultan's mother. What followed was a deadly struggle for control between the 2 women. The palace was split into 2 factions. The climax came on a September night in 1651, when Turhan Sultan's supporters stormed Kösem's chambers. The most powerful woman in Ottoman history was found hiding in a small cabinet. She was dragged out and strangled with a curtain, her reign ending in a violent coup orchestrated by another harem woman. The Sultanate of Women demonstrates the ultimate truth of the harem. It was never just a place of sex and seclusion. It was a political institution where sexual favor was the currency of power. These women, who started as powerless slaves, learned to master the system that was designed to control them. They used their intelligence, their ambition, and their intimate access to the Sultan to become kingmakers, regents, and rulers. They proved that the desires nurtured and manipulated within the silken cage could and did change the course of an empire. The imperial harem was officially dissolved in the early 20th century with the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The great wooden doors were unbolted, and the last of its inhabitants were pensioned off and sent out into a world they had never known. Today, the harem at Topkapi Palace is a museum. Tourists walk the Golden Road, marveling at the intricate tile work and mother-of-pearl inlay. They peer into the empty chambers, trying to imagine the lives that were lived there. But the silence of these halls is deceptive. If you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes. You can hear the laughter of girls learning to play the oud, the whispered prayers of a mother for her son's survival, the rustle of silk as a woman walks to meet her fate, and the confident commands of a Valide Sultan dictating a letter to a king. The harem was a paradox. It was a prison that offered a path to almost limitless power. It was a system of sexual servitude that produced some of the most politically influential women in history. It was a place of deep loneliness and intense community, of brutal rivalry and profound love. The Western fantasy of the harem, with its erotic, passive odalisques, tells us more about the West's own desires than it does about the reality of the women who lived there. They were not simply objects of pleasure. They were agents in their own right. They were students, artists, mothers, politicians, and survivors. They navigated a world of unimaginable restriction with intelligence and resilience, wielding the only weapons they had, their wits, their bodies, and their unyielding ambition. The story of the harem is not a simple tale of oppression or a titillating fantasy. It is a deeply human story about the complex, often brutal interplay between sex, power, and survival. It reminds us that desire is never just about pleasure. It is about the fundamental human drive to leave a mark, to shape one's own destiny, even from within the confines of a silken cage.